So on Wednesday at Virtually Bible in the Pub, we had some great discussion looking at Acts chapter 7. There's some really interesting comments around resurrection and the resurrection body. And so I just thought just wanted to follow up a little bit with that and just offer a couple of thoughts about places you could go if you want to think a bit more about Christ's resurrection and indeed about our own physical resurrection. And the first of those two places is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is sort of the seminal, the main thrust of the passage from Paul is all around that physical resurrection of the body. Paul talks about why it matters for us that Christ was physically resurrected. He talks about what that means for us, and he goes on to reflect a little bit himself on what the nature of our physically resurrected bodies might be like. The other place to look at, a couple of chapters right at the end of John. So John chapter 20 and 21. In each of the Gospels there are, of course, different versions of that post-resurrection period, different perspectives on it. But these two chapters in John, I think, offer some really interesting things for reflection around Christ's own physically resurrected body. One of the things we believe as Christians about the physical resurrection is that Christ's own resurrection is the first fruits of our resurrection and the redemption of all creation. And so it is interesting to think a little bit about Christ's own physically resurrected body, what that looks like, what that didn't look like, and perhaps what that might say about us. And I am mindful that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul does say in verse 35, someone may ask, how are the dead raised? What kind of body will they come? How foolish. But I don't feel too bad, because then Paul goes on to reflect for a few more verses on his own thoughts about what the resurrected body might look like. And so, we see in John 20 and 21 some of the stories of Jesus post-resurrection. We hear the story of when he's in the garden and Mary comes to him thinking he's the gardener. Now, we don't know why she thinks he's the gardener. She was obviously moved with great grief, but perhaps it was because he looks similar and yet not quite the same as Jesus did. We know that she goes to hug him and he says, "Don't hold on to me." Then we have the story of Jesus appearing in the room with the disciples and saying, "Peace be with you." That somehow he appears inside this locked room, and yet they're able to touch him, and Thomas is able to put his hands in his wounds. And again, we know that Jesus has those wounds post-resurrection. What does that mean for our post-resurrection bodies? Then that beautiful story of Jesus appearing on the beach with the disciples and creating a fire and eating with them. We know he's not a ghost because he eats with them and he walks with Peter afterwards. These are all interesting insights into what Jesus' post-resurrection body was like, and perhaps some insights for us, some things to reflect on for us about what our own post-resurrection bodies may look like. Jumping back to 1 Corinthians 15, Paul uses a really helpful analogy. For me personally, I find this very helpful anyway. And it is that in verse 37, in verse 36 and 37, he says, "What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed." And then in 38, "But God gives it a body as he has determined, and to each kind of seed he gives its own body." It's important that when we think about post-resurrection life, we don't get caught up in the detail of it. Will we be married? Will we not be? Will we have jobs? All these sorts of things. I find that analogy of a seed quite useful because it does remind us that what will come will be similar and yet different. In a sense, the seeds of the new heaven and the new earth are all around us in the created world that we live in now, and therefore the seeds of our resurrected body are in our own physical appearance and presence as it is now. And yet, of course, it's not the same. When Christ was resurrected, he was similar and yet different. And so it will be with us, I think, and with all of creation when there is that new heaven and new earth. But if you do want to think a little bit more about this, I'd encourage you just, over a cup of coffee, just have a look through 1 Corinthians 15 and John 20 and 21. And just be asking yourself, what does this say to me about resurrection? It's really important that we engage with the fact that as Christians, one of our foundational beliefs is that Christ is physically resurrected. And that's not just important for what lies ahead in the future, but it also talks about how the physical world now is worth redeeming for God. We can't just dismiss it and hope for a spiritual existence in the future. Being a Christian is not about cutting ourselves off from the physical world around us. If God has seen fit to redeem Christ's body, to redeem creation, then we cannot condemn it. And so it is important for us to be thinking and reflecting about it. But yeah, grab a cup of coffee, have a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, John 20, 21. Do let me know any comments or thoughts that you might have. And keep thinking and reflecting and praying in this Easter time particularly about what does Christ's resurrection mean for us, mean for creation, both now and in the world to come.